I am excited to have such a wonderful group of attorneys and judges here to share their career experiences with us. In alphabetical order, I'm just going to give very short introduction to each one because I'm sure you want to hear from them. You've been listening to me long enough. But Susan Garcia is Associate General Counsel for Thomson Reuters Legal Division. So she's going to represent the in-house counsel sector of our profession. Margaret Garnett hails from the public sector, the Office of the Attorney General, where she is the Executive Deputy Attorney General for Criminal Justice, and she supervises the work of the Criminal Division. Gutekunst is with a nonprofit organization now. She is the first full-time executive director of Judges and Lawyers Breast Cancer Alert. She was previously president of the New York State Bar Association in 2016 to 2017, and she maintains a practice doing mediation and alternative dispute resolution. Rory Lareris, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, you are.
Thank goodness, has been a partner in the litigation department at Cravath, Swain & Moore since 2017. So she's one of the new partners who followed the Trailblazer, and she began her career at that firm in 2008. So she's going to represent kind of our young partners, very young partners, I might add. And the Honorable Diane Renwick is a Justice of the Appellate Division First Department, where she has served with distinction on that bench for 10 of the 20 years that she's been a member of the judiciary. Having been a housing court, civil court, and Supreme Court judge, did you miss any of the trial courts? She's the first African-American woman appointed to the First Department, which was a marvelous achievement. What I'm going to do, I'm going to begin asking some of them each a question, but then I have some general questions that they can kind of raise their hand or indicate they want to answer, and we'll kind of get into a conversation here. You know, when studying the history of the women that we heard about this evening, interestingly, several of them wrote about what a strong influence their fathers had on them. Mainly because their fathers had studied law. Margaret, what inspired you to become an attorney, and did you encounter any obstacle in pursuing that dream?
So I grew up with no lawyers in my family at all. I'm still the only lawyer in my family. I grew up in a military family. My father and both my grandfathers and all of my uncles were all career military people. So
can you pull the microphone
sure.
a little closer?
So I really had no, I didn't really know what lawyers did, but when I was a child, I was always interested in detective stories and stories about legal cases. So I grew up as a child thinking that might be something I wanted to do, but I didn't really know what that meant. And when I was in college, I had professors who encouraged me to go on an academic career path. And so because I didn't really know what, the few lawyers that I knew didn't seem to have career paths that seemed right for me. And I just wasn't aware of what the range of what lawyers could do. So I initially went to graduate school to be an academic and to be a professor. And it feels strange to say this in the setting, but I happened to have a boyfriend who was in law school while I was a miserable graduate student. And I was always much more interested in, he didn't particularly like law school as it happened, but I was much more interested in what he was learning and doing than what I was doing, and I finally decided to go down that path myself and went to law school a little bit later, I think, than is normal. But I think what I did have from my father and other relatives, most of the women in my family didn't work, or if they did, they were teachers or nurses. They didn't really have professional careers, but I think for my father's career in that example was to find work that is meaningful to you. Find work where you feel that you are making a difference in the world, that you're in the right spot, and that you are really contributing. And so for me, once I got to law school, eventually, I really embraced that, and the law seemed like a place where you could do work that was meaningful, where you could find a lot of different ways to feel like you were making a contribution. So, but I think the hardest thing for me was I certainly didn't know any women lawyers, and I didn't know any lawyers at all growing up. So it took me kind of a while to find my way to that.
And how did you end up at the Department of Law?
So when I did finally go to law school, I went with the idea that I might want to be a prosecutor. And so I spent most of my practicing career at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District as a criminal prosecutor. And then about almost a year ago now, I had the opportunity to take the job as the chief of the criminal division at the AG's office. So I've been there about 8 months now.
Susan, law firms sometimes will lose associates or partners to their corporate clients. They will go in-house, particularly some of the young women who have relationships with those clients. What factors encouraged you to become an in-house counsel, and what was the path you took to that position?
I also came from a family with no lawyers. I actually really had no idea what it meant to be a lawyer growing up. I'm product of immigrant parents. Both my parents are Cuban. I was born in New York City, Washington Heights. So I grew up with a real strong sense of justice and equal rights, but never really had an idea of what it meant to be a lawyer. My beginning of my career, I started as a transactional lawyer, a corporate lawyer at Cadwalader, and from there I went to Clifford Chance. And at both law firms, I knew very quickly that it wasn't a very friendly or accommodating place for anyone who wanted balance. And also, as a corporate lawyer, you were sort of on a transaction, and you went from deal to deal, and you never really knew what happened to that transaction, how the corporation actually managed after that acquisition or the divestiture. So I really wanted that strong sense of working within a corporation to really see the evolution of those deals. But the day that I realized I did not want to be in a law firm was in Cadwalader. We were working on a deal. I'm dating myself. This was before email distribution. And we were distributing all of the documents throughout New York City by messenger. And by the time we were done, it was about 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I went to all of the partners' offices to leave the documents on their chair. And my last partner that I was giving the documents to was a super senior partner. He had probably been practicing for over 40 years. And I thought, I'll just leave it on his chair. I'm sure he's not there. And I walk into his office, and he was there. And I thought to myself, I'm not doing this in 40 years. And I really, after Clifford Chance, I came to Reuters. I always wanted to be a journalist, so I thought that was a good combination. And I really, I think being an in-house counsel, working with outside counsel, we're in a unique position to be able to shape the careers of women at law firms and really demand of our law firms diversity in staffing deals, diversity in staffing litigation cases, and really being able to nurture and grow the careers of women. When I graduated law school, 1997, we were the first class at Penn where women surpassed men. And fast forward almost 30 years later, and women have not, the higher levels, partnerships and general counsel positions haven't changed that much. And so I think in-house counsel, females in corporations that are in a position to be able to demand fair and equitable representation on matters is very important.
Have you found the law firms receptive to that type of
Absolutely.
inclusion requirement?
Absolutely. I think what I've found is that when I raise it, most of the time, it's very well-intentioned people that with just a blind spot. They don't think. They don't. What you don't see, you don't think about. And if you're not thinking about diversity up front, then you're not going to really act. So I think that all of the law firms that we work with have been extraordinarily receptive, and in fact, a little sheepish after we pointed out that we want diverse representation on our matters.
Rory, you attended law school with more female colleagues than most of us who went to school decades ago. What encouraged your interest in the law practice, and how did you manage to achieve partnership at such a young age? I can say that. Carmen and I can say that.
Yeah, so I also did not have lawyers in my family. I graduated college, and I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I thought potentially graduate school in psychology or something, but I decided to come to New York for a couple of years and work as a legal assistant and just see what happened. And I think most of the people that I started with as a legal assistant who had aspirations to go to law school quickly decided that wasn't for them, and I actually saw what the lawyers that I worked with were doing and thought, it looked pretty fun. So I gave law school a shot, and when I was interviewing at firms, I really just tried to keep an open mind and feel where I had connections, and I had really strong connections, I felt at the time, at Cravath, and I think I chose right. I still didn't know exactly where my career would take me. I don't think I had any clear aspiration to become a partner at Cravath or anywhere else. I just decided I would, stay there until I didn't have fun anymore, and I continued to have fun the whole time. So that's where I've basically spent, my legal career, and I think I chose right. I based my decision in part on those connections that really held true, and some of the people that I interviewed with that I felt those connections with became, some of my closest mentors at Cravath. That said, it's a hard career, as I'm sure most of the people in this room know, and I work a lot. I worked a lot as an associate. I work a lot as a partner. I don't see that changing anytime soon, so you have to balance and you have to figure out how to manage those pressures, those competing pressures. I had my first baby the year that I was up for partner, which was a little bit stressful. But I think I was reassured really quickly after that kind of moment of panic that this timing is maybe complicated. Many partners for whom I worked reassured me quickly that it was a non-issue, a non-factor.
Christine would be happy to hear that. Do you
Christine-
still have a child care center that she started?
I do, and actually when I came back, that was critical to my ability to transition smoothly, I think. That was, when I came back from maternity leave, there were only a few months left before the partnership decision, and I knew it was, a very critical time for me personally and professionally. I had taken my maternity leave and been left alone, and I came back, and the first day back at work, I got to bring my son with me, and he came every day for 6 months, and I dropped him off downstairs at the Christine Bashar Children's Center and got to see him and nurse him and visit with him if I needed a little fix, and take him home with me at the end of the day, or if I couldn't leave at a reasonable hour, then my husband would come pick him up, and it really, really made things easier. And I see it's not just the women at Cravath that do that, it's the men too, and it's staff members too, it's not just lawyers, and it's amazing how much that can make a big difference. And just having that atmosphere and the environment where it's clear that your colleagues get it and support your life. I don't think you can have balance unless you have that. You have to have a supportive family too, which I am lucky to have, but having supportive colleagues is critical, and I think that's part of why I've continued to work at Cravath and why I continue to love my job.
Claire, as past president of one of the most prestigious bar associations in the country, what initiatives did you introduce that you felt would help women in the profession, and what are your thoughts on progress of women?
Well, I don't want to speak only about initiatives that I did, but talk more generally about initiatives, because some of it just happens from other people getting excited and doing things. I think overall we have made progress, but we still, I think the title of this is something like, are we there yet or something? And I think the answer is no, or is there equality? And the answer is no. That's a pretty easy one. I think bar associations, and I mean the whole spectrum of bar associations, can play a very important role. Helping to do studies, because people will answer their questions and they can do the studies, to write reports and articles to shine a light on the issues that are important. And I've been involved in women's issues since I got started in bar associations, because I was an associate at Proskauer, and Louisa Kaye's father was the chair of the department, the litigation department, and I was working with him, and I would go into my end-of-year evaluation, and he would say, you're doing really well, blah, 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 because of course I was working with him, he wanted to encourage me. But what are you doing for bar association work? And I'd say, oh, well, Steve, you know how busy I am, and I want to see my husband. He said, that's great, but what are you doing for bar association work? So when I was a fifth-year associate, Ruth Shapiro, who some of you know or have heard of, was the first woman partner at Proskauer, and she was in the real estate department, but she was the first chair of our special committee on women in the courts at the state bar, and she asked me, her third year in, would you like to be on that committee? And I said, what do I have to do? And she said, well, a couple hours a month, you have to go to a meeting at Proskauer. I said, I can handle that, and I can get my check mark from Steve Kaye at the end of the year, and he'll stop asking me, what are you doing for bar association? So that's how I got involved with women in the law. And I ended up, because I'm a person who can't just go to a meeting for 2 hours, I ended up on subcommittees and then chairing subcommittees and then vice chair and chairing the committee. So I was there for 8 years. And that's how I got involved in the state bar. And I think a lot of people out there got involved through being passionate about something. And if you're passionate about it, then there is a place for you. So we did lots of reports over time, and I see another chair of the committee out there, former chair who I invited to the committee. But becoming president, to fast forward, gave me the chance to sort of coalesce and to have a bully pulpit, if you will. So during my, we have a state bar journal that comes out, I think, 9 times a year, and you get to do a president's message. So I think my first president's message was diversity and inclusion are everybody's business. And one of mine during Women's History Month was illuminating and eliminating bias against women, with the theory that we so often talk to ourselves, to each other, but this was a way in a page to get out some of the important points out to maybe some of the men out there, and not just to the women. And I actually got a nice email from one of the men in the association, nobody I knew, wrote me thanking me for my message about women, and I thought, wow, okay, at least I reached one guy. So during my time, though, our commercial and federal litigation section had, I think, 7 or 8 women chairs, former chairs, who decided it was time to take some action within the court system. And in your materials tonight is the report that they did, and this is a freestanding one, If Not Now, When? Achieving Equality for Women Attorneys in the Courtroom and in ADR. And I can take very little credit for it, although I was on the executive committee of the commercial and federal litigation section. I wasn't a former chair, and I wasn't really that involved in doing this. But they did a survey in the state courts and in the federal courts to see where are women getting speaking roles, and they found that no, by and large, they're not. It's a little bit better if you're in family court and that sort of thing, but you go into the Court of Appeals or the First Department, and there's very few women who are actually standing up there speaking. And so they came out with this report, which was adopted just, I think, just after my presidency, I think a year ago in June. And it has been making some changes. Some judges have been adopting new rules that, and we can talk about that, I know that's one of your questions about the courts, as a result of these women who come from all different kinds of backgrounds, the U.S. Attorney's Office, from law firms, coming together and a judge, the former judge, Shara Schindlin. So that's one thing that the bar's done. Our Committee on Women in the Law, which is the committee that I had chaired so many years before, decided during my term to do a dedicated bar journal to making strides, how women are gaining under the law and in service to it. Again, pulling together a lot of interesting articles and getting it out there to a not mass, because, well, relatively speaking, mass audience at the State Bar, but a general audience, not just to women, with very interesting articles. I was reading some of them and said, oh yeah, those were good ideas that those people had about, how to fix your diversity initiative, et cetera. But I don't want to limit it to the New York State Bar Association, because this association, the New York County Lawyers Association, many county bars around the state have women in the law or women in the profession committees that have really done some groundbreaking work. And then you have the Women's Bar Association of the State of New York, and it's 19, I think now, 19 chapters around the state. Maybe there's 20, anyway, 20 or 21, okay. Chapters around the state that have been, seminal work in the area of women in the law, and also provided a place for women to have mentoring, to have networking, to have friendships and support, as well as to get referrals and to get leadership roles. And that's one of the things that I think bar associations can give women, and I really recommend not just women, but minorities and men as well, but it is an opportunity to get leadership, a leadership role, and that's something that I would encourage people to do. I mean, a lot of you out there already, I'm speaking to the converted, a lot of you have run committees, whether they relate to women or they relate to substantive work. Bar associations can provide that sort of training ground, and I really feel that that helped me a lot in learning to be a leader within my law firm, to the extent I got to be, through being a leader within my committee, and then, sort of working my way up in the state bar. And one thing that happened this last weekend, which is exciting for us, is that our Committee on Women in the Law that did this journal, and they did a number of other projects and reports, said with 50 people on a committee, we don't have the bandwidth. We don't have the women power, the person power to do everything we need to do. We really ought to be a section. So last week, our House of Delegates voted to make the Committee on Women in the Law into a section, Women in the Law section, which will be open to all members of the association, and you pay like $35 in dues. And then you can be involved at whatever level people want to be involved. And hopefully it will give us greater bandwidth within the association to do more.
And attract more women to join.
Attract more women to join and to rise up within the association. I was the 6th I was the 119th president, and I was the 6th woman president. So we and we did have a 7th woman president last year, but still, there's a ways to go as far as that goes.
Thank you. Thank you for your statewide perspective. Justice Renwick, you had to be proud to be a first in terms of diversity on your fabulous court. What are your thoughts on how we can improve the bar and the judiciary to better reflect the vast diversity of our Empire State?
Well, before I address the question, I have to say, Vicki and Carmen, I just want people to know, again, if they came in late or didn't hear, I think we are so fortunate to have in our presence the first African-American and first African-American woman, and perhaps the first woman, am I correct? Second woman, United States Attorney General, former United States Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, in our presence. So grateful that you're here. A tremendous career, and we're so fortunate that we'll be able to chat with you afterwards. As for the question, I'm pleased to be the first, of course, but wise enough to know that when you wait 114 years before you appoint a woman, there are other qualified women at that point, and certainly there were other qualified African-American women to be appointed to the position. I'm proud that, and I will say this also, it kind of gets tired to be the first. And unfortunately, as I'm sure Loretta can attest to from her own perspective, I was the first, I'm sure she was the first in many things, or you're the only in many places that you go. And what we want is to increase the numbers, so we're not the firsts anymore, and we're not the, hey, look at there's an African-American woman over there in that corner. You know, you want to have we want to appear in greater numbers, for sure. I am proud, however, that the court I am on has made great strides in appointing, or the governor, I would say, the governors of the state of New York, in appointing women to the court. And the first woman, Betty Weinberg Ellerin, who I'm sure many of you know, arrived in 1984. She was on that court for 20 years, but spent the first 10 years on her own. By herself, as the only woman with however many were on the bench. As she likes to say, the odds were even though she was the only woman. And thereafter, in 1994, I believe, Angela Mazzarelli arrived. So they together overlapped for 10 years, just the two of them, before Betty retired, and then Angela Mazzarelli was on her own for about 3 years. And then in 2008, the pace picked up, and Carla Moskowitz was appointed, and then I was appointed and happened to be the first, as was said, the African-American woman. And after that, the numbers just continued to increase. Each year, we had Roz Richter, the first lesbian woman appointed statewide, I think, to any court. We had Sally Manzanet, the first Hispanic woman appointed to the first department. And since then, we have had 15 women on that court, which is wonderful. Right now, we have 10 out of 18, and we have been the majority in that court for several years now. I would say at least 6 years. And I have to say, it is wonderful to sit on a panel with, I know this was not the answer to your question, the large question, but I have to say, it is just wonderful to sit on a panel with 5 women and to see the looks on the faces of men sometimes when they come in, and it's really wonderful. But it doesn't, that our court has many women, that the courts generally, I think we're getting to the point where perhaps there are more women than men. I don't know, it certainly doesn't end there, because, to address your question, it has to do with diversifying the women and people of color who are on the bench, who are in the law, and how do we do that? I think we have to do what we're doing now. We have to keep these issues in the forefront of our minds. We have to discuss them constantly, and we have to institute measures so that the change is made. Claire, you mentioned the report. I think it's an excellent report, and it also gives suggestions for what we should do. So it's not enough to talk about it, because we've talked about it. I know that in 2011, that's what happens when you have many women on the court. We sit around and have lunch or breakfast, and, we end up chatting about issues, and from that was born the idea to have roundtables to discuss why we just weren't seeing many women arguing commercial cases, even though their names were on the briefs. And so Roz Richter from my court spearheaded this roundtable where we had lots of attorneys and partners, women, all women, attorneys and partners and members of the judiciary, and we spoke about it, and we came up with some suggestions, and I think it was excellent. I don't see that from that point to now, such tremendous change has been made. And then I think in 2014, we had another panel. It was an excellent panel. Again, a number of wonderful ideas, but I don't see that so much change was made. So I think that if we don't, and talking is great, and it's important that we do this, but if we don't do something to make the change permanent, I think that the change won't happen. So what kinds of things did the report suggest? I think it's worth sort of talking about some of them. Women's initiatives, establishing and supporting women's initiatives where we talk to partners or have partners provide speaking opportunities in court and at depositions for women. Instead of having women's names, having women write the briefs or have their names on the briefs, actually have the people who write the briefs argue before the court. I think that's an excellent opportunity. Institute training and education programs, courtroom skills in the firms, if that's what's necessary. I think women have to engage in pro bono work so that they can actually argue cases, try cases, and then it's one more thing that they can have in their favor to argue why they should be the person to present the argument in court. Leadership training, having guest speakers, having mentorship programs. Without instituting those things in firms, I think that we won't get the traction we need to really see the numbers. Also, formal programs to ensure leadership roles in court and in other aspects. So establishing a formal program through which management or heads of litigation departments can ensure that junior associates are provided with speaking opportunities in court and at depositions. Tracking speaking opportunities in court and at depositions on a quarterly basis so that we can really see whether or not the change is happening, as opposed to, as you said, being, having it sort of, in the rear view, actually keep track of it so that you can see if you are achieving what's necessary to increase the numbers of women. Promote outside speaking opportunities, provide junior attorneys with the opportunity to speak outside, to speak to clients, actually, instead of just sitting beside the partner. I will say one thing that I find, and a number of my colleagues I know can support me on this. One thing I have found that has improved since 2011 and 2014 is that now, instead of not seeing the women at all, sometimes we see women sitting at the table. Or, for example, we'll note if I am on the bench and Sally Manzanet, who's Hispanic, and Troy Weber, we may see a partner, and there's an African-American woman sitting beside. And I say to myself, now, I know that the attorneys who appear for the prosecutor's office or for the defense on criminal cases, and that person doesn't look familiar. And of course, when the case is called, the big firm comes up, sits at the table, and the partner, man, speaks, but there's a person of color at the table. Look, it is a step in the right direction, but we do need now to have the women actually get up at the podium, and the earth won't stop spinning, and actually have them take those roles. So I think that those are some of the things we need to do, and I think as women, we don't promote ourselves enough. And, I think we need to, I don't think that there's anyone who's necessarily a shrinking violet, but I think we have to learn to promote ourselves, become more outspoken, become more assertive, and ask for what we want more often.
Well, we appreciate that your court has been on the forefront of that. As an anecdote, I remember the first time at the Court of Appeals when I was aware there were 4 women at the tables, and of course there were 2 women arguing. And I wrote a note and I passed it to Chief Judge Kaye, and the note said, "Did you ever think you'd see the day when there were all women at the counsel table?" And she wrote back, amazing. I wish I had kept that note, but it just made such an impression, for sure. We have a lot of discussion about the importance of mentoring. Do any of you want to comment about mentoring and what it meant in your career? One of my mentors is here this evening, the former presiding justice of the 3rd Department, Karen Peters. She did me a great favor in offering my first position in government service, for which I will be eternally grateful. I thought I had left my firm because it was disintegrating. I was the only woman in the firm, and they were splitting up into 4 separate practices, and there was a lot of animosity. So I decided, well, I'll take a short stint in state service while I get ready to start my own practice, and that turned into 32 years. So I don't know if she did me a favor or not, but I'm very grateful to her. So does the gender of a mentor matter, Claire?
Sure. I think mentors are important. I think in this day and age, we also have to talk about sponsors, which is sort of the new term. But I think it is critical to have mentors, and I was very fortunate to have mentors. Should it be a man or a woman? I think you could have both. But realistically, certainly when I was starting out in the early 1980s, and I think probably still now, more of the people who are in a position to advance the career of a woman or anybody else in a law firm are going to be men, because they still control most of the business and are in most of the leadership positions. And so I would say certainly do not shrink from having a man as the mentor or the sponsor, because that's probably going to get you there more quickly in many instances. Fortunately, there are more women who have more powerful roles in some cases. But it is critical. It can be either organic or formal, and I think both of those have roles. So Steve Kaye became my mentor because I was working like crazy for him for many, many years. But he also became, my mentor and very good friend, and my sponsor. And to get into sponsorship, for those of you who are less familiar with that terminology, the sponsor is somebody who plays a role in advancing your career. So it doesn't just help you out, but really becomes your advocate to get the opportunities, introduces you to the people in power within the firm, and gives you the opportunities to meet the people with whom you can develop business, and then advocates for you in, say, the partnership meeting when someone is they're trying to decide whether you should become partner or not. And that's a really critical thing to have. So that's sort of in my case, that was an organic, because I worked with him, so we just became close, and just from spending, crazy hours together. But then I also had a formal mentoring process when I was a junior associate at Proskauer. And when I was a second-year associate, my formal mentor, who was another partner in the litigation department, we had lunch, and he said, it's time for you to get your own little case, at which point I had just started working like crazy trying to get the complaint out on a big case with Steve, and my big first case. I said, I can't do it now, but within 6 months, he got me on a small case, which gave me my first opportunity to argue a summary judgment motion, and then having amazingly prevailed in that, and fortunately it was up in Saratoga County, so nobody from the firm was there to see me. I got to argue in the 3rd Department, because the firm made the decision that while there was a partner at the time, because I was, I think, a 3rd-year associate, there was a partner who was kind of looking over my shoulder and making sure the papers were good and whatnot, that it was not that big a case. The client, they could take a chance on me and let me argue it in the 3rd Department. And that's what's really necessary. So that was an important thing, to have the formal program, so as not to let me just kind of slide along without getting that opportunity. So I think you can have both of those things, but it is very important to have it. And the men out there, you're the ones who really need to make it happen within the firm. The diversity initiatives are great, the women's initiatives are great, but it's just not enough. the formal programs are not what's going to make the difference in a young woman or an older woman's career. It's going to help, and having those speaking opportunities and all of those things, but it's the one-on-one. It's the person who has the case who then says, gee, I've kind of heard that these judges in the appellate division would like to hear women speak. Let me let her speak, give the gal a chance. In my case, we had this big case that I started as a second-year associate with Steve. By the time I was a fifth-year associate, we were still working on it and doing the depositions, having gone up to the Court of Appeals and back down. And Arthur Lyman from Paul Weiss, many of you probably have heard of him, he was kind of a big-shot lawyer, was examining the key corporate witness for our side. And Steve was defending the deposition, and I was sitting there. It was down at the court because it was a sufficiently vituperative case that we had a special master overseeing our depositions. And at a certain point, I was second seating, Steve got up, said, you take over, and walked out of the room. Now, there was no reason. He didn't have to go to the bathroom. He didn't have any reason to walk out of the room except that he wanted me to have the opportunity to defend my client against Arthur Lyman and to say, I can do it. And we need more people to do that.
I'll just,
Rory?
yeah, I was just
I
gonna,
was going to ask you if your
Sure.
firm has formal, informal, or what your experience was?
we have both, and I had both. I had a number of informal mentors plus a formal mentor, and I think it's absolutely critical. I second everything that Claire said, including the sponsor point. And I guess I'd add a third category that I think is important, and that's just having role models, people that you look up to who you see doing what you want to do down the road in your career. And I had that in multiple people, not just partners, but senior associates who trained me, and that sort of apprentice model that we have at my firm, at least, that I think is critical to developing as a lawyer, but it means very close relationships, and as I alluded to earlier, I think that's absolutely critical. And one of the problems that I see in why we haven't made more progress is the issue of retention. We have lots of female law students graduating and starting at firms, and it's just a matter of keeping them. And I think one way to keep more female lawyers in the profession, and particularly at firms, is to make sure that they're getting excellent experience and that they're having fun. And the way to do that is to give them really cool things to do. And you get client pushback sometimes who, they want to pay for what they want to pay for, and sometimes that means they insist on having the senior partner argue a case. But if they don't, and I have more and more clients now who welcome associates arguing or taking depositions, or at least younger partners, and all of that is great. You occasionally see judges who have rules in place that say only fifth years and younger can argue before me. And that's excellent, because what that means is that there's a much greater likelihood that a woman is going to get to do that cool role in court or at a deposition or whatever, and the client just is stuck with it if that's the barrier. But it also just means that you build on the experience, and you kind of, personally, if you've done that and you've gotten to argue in court, or you've gotten to take your first deposition as a junior associate, you can check the box in your head and you feel more confident later, and that's really important. It's also important to be able to tell clients that you've had that experience, and so they feel more comfortable, and it just all kind of, I think, helps all around with retention and making sure that both you and the people who are around you see that this is doable and that it's fun and that it's part of the job. And I think that would go a long way. The more that happens, I think the better we'll get it at retaining female talent long-term, not just for a few years.
I think, I just want to comment on, I think having mentors is crucial when you think that there are so many people who don't have lawyers in their families. How are they supposed to know what to do beyond law school? It just seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? And I also think that it's key for people of color to have mentors. And, to have special programs, which is why I encourage new lawyers, African-American lawyers, lawyers of color to join bar associations, to join specialty bar associations where people are going to look out for them and mentor them. I also think that and I'll tell you why. One of the things we do in the appellate divisions is admit new attorneys. And I sit there sometimes and scratch my head because out of 80 new attorneys, sometimes there's one African-American male, 2 women. I mean, if I see 5 African-Americans I'm talking about, because there are other groups of people where there are far more, if I see 5, that's very, very many. Oftentimes, it's just 2 or 3. And I think, so what is the reason? People aren't making it to law school. I know the numbers keep increasing, but very slowly. And I think for people of color, there have to be other kinds of programs and other kinds of mentoring positions, programs to sort of pull them through. And I know that they have started programs called pipeline programs, for example, where children are encouraged in colleges. I know John Jay has such a program where the student comes in and then can apply to this special program. There it's called the Ron Brown program. And they are mentored, given law classes, given tutoring with the LSATs, writing programs, all of these kinds of programs from the time they're in their sophomore year. And so that by the time they get to be seniors, they are prepared to apply to law school. And also part of that is an intensive training program during the summer. I know that St. John's does it with, that John Jay does it with St. John's Law School, but that the professor at John Jay has also started such a partnership program with Buffalo Law School and also University of Texas. And they follow the students through law school, and they have 95% retention and graduation from law school. So that's a tremendous program, and that's the kind of thing that I think will increase the numbers of African Americans in law. But mentoring throughout this program is key. It's crucial. So yes, I think mentorship is very important, and I think it's not only for lawyers, but for certain people, it's before that. So taking advantage of these programs and finding students to mentor in these programs, I think, are crucial for retention throughout.
And I would underscore it can start even before law school. I know I work with some of the pre-law societies at the Capital District. I live in Albany County, so I work with some of the colleges in the Capital District, and I've identified several real collegiate stars, particularly at Siena College, and one of them is now doing great as an associate at my law firm. I stayed in touch with her through her moot court experiences and then at law school, and then she went to work at another firm. She called me up one day, had lunch with her. She said, "I'm not terribly happy." I said, "Well, I got a place for you." So, and it's important because, I came from a family, my parents were first generation. They knew no lawyers other than when they bought their house. Maybe, and I'm sure they didn't have a lawyer, there must have been a bank lawyer there. They had never had any association with an attorney, and I was the first in my family to go to college. So people like that, it helps if there's somebody who, at an early stage, you speak to. If you can go into I think we owe it as a profession, if we can go into the high schools, go into the colleges. You don't have to do it every month. You do it a couple of times a year, and you'd be surprised how students remember that. And it means something to them that somebody cared enough to say, think about this, or what are you thinking of doing when you get out? Give them some suggestions of things they can go and see, or I always tell students, you can go to the courthouses. They are public. You can go and sit and watch a trial, and they're surprised by that. It's, we forget that there are still so many young people whose families have no exposure to our profession. And I think that's where we're going to get more diversity from, and also give those families an opportunity for advancement.
And to be clear, Vicki, I just want to, the program I'm talking about is one that begins in college. So it starts at John Jay, and it's a pipeline program, which those types of programs I think are so important, and important for us to seek out if we really want to mentor and help make a difference in the process.
Of course, the other major obstacle that we hear about all the time, and there's certainly not a one-size-fits-all model for this, but it's how to balance child rearing and family obligations with a legal career. Do any of you have any suggestions for the women who are struggling with that currently?
I can share my experience. When I started at Reuters, talking about mentoring, the general counsel at the time, Nancy Gardner, had children. She had worked part-time for a while as general counsel. And so seeing her as that kind of trailblazer in the corporate environment, being able to balance both family and the demands of her career was incredibly important. And after I had my own kids, I have 3 kids within 3 years, which was very tight. And I decided to take time off. At the time, I was at NBC Universal, and it was a very demanding job. And when I was home, Nancy actually called me and asked me if I would work part-time for now Thomson Reuters. And I think that having that kind of openness to have flexibility, if you don't have on-site childcare, to be able to just have a working environment where you can be flexible enough in this day and age. There's no reason why you can't work remotely, especially if you're on email or writing briefs or drafting contracts. And just have that open culture where you don't have to be there 24/7. The legal profession, it's a tough thing because we're all trained to be apprentices and to be physically in the office for long hours. And I think that's the culture change that really needs to happen to create a working environment that's, at least from my perspective, that's more virtual, more flexible, that allows that sort of balance. It's hard because then the boundaries start getting pushed, and there are no boundaries in my life. But it's a cost that I'm willing to pay to be able to have both work and family.
Margaret, the Department of Law has always had a fair number of women as bureau heads and administrators, and, managing a number of attorneys, top administrators such as yourself. How does the Office of the Attorney General handle these family issues?
Well, it's definitely true. I mean, as I said, I've been there only not even a full year, but for me, it's the first place I've ever worked as a lawyer in, almost 20 years, where there is a critical mass, a significant number of women in the senior leadership of the entity, the agency, and it's great. I have to tell you, it is great. And it's not only because, sort of for the obvious reasons, that it's nice to have other women around, but I think the thing that I have found, sort of to my surprise, I didn't anticipate this, is how having more women in the room at senior levels, and I think you probably experience this on the Court of Appeals, what you're talking about, there's a funny way in that it lessens the burden of gender representation. You're still a woman, and that's a valuable perspective, but it frees you to be every part of your identity. For most of my career as a lawyer, I was often the only woman in a leadership role or the only woman in the room at a meeting, and I didn't put too much weight on that, but now in a situation where there are so many women, I really feel the weight of that lifted off me, because when you're the only woman or one of only a few, everything you say or do is attributed to your femaleness, and you become, representative of this is how women are. Margaret, what is the woman's perspective on this issue? When there are many women, you can be all parts of your identity, including your perspective as a woman or a mother or whatever, but that no longer is the only thing about you or the most important thing about you. So, I have found that really transformative. And, on the family issues, to circle back to that, I had my children relatively late in my career when I was already in a supervisory role at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I had no mentors or role models who were women. I mostly had worked in places where there just weren't many women in leadership roles, and those that there were didn't have children. But at the U.S. Attorney's Office, I had a lot of peers who had done it, and we were incredibly supportive of each other. And when I came back after my maternity leave, I realized I'm going to have to work differently. And I felt very lucky to already be a supervisor, and I decided, you know what? I'm just going to do it and see what happens. I'm just going to leave most days at 6:30, and so I can see my children, and I'm going to be present in other ways and demonstrate that I'm committed to the work in other ways. And what's the worst that can happen? They're not going to demote me, right? So I just did it, and I think it's so important for women who are already in leadership positions or in positions of some prominence in their organization to, remain committed, put the same priority on the work, but communicate by their actions that you can continue to be successful. And when your children are extremely young, do what you need to do to be present for your family. And I think I had a lot of peer support in that, even though I really had no role models of women that I knew personally who had been very successful lawyers and also had families.
It is certainly very helpful to have a group of women to be supportive like that. I remember when I was at Proskauer and I was about fifth year and I'm starting to think, well, maybe you're going to want to have a kid. And one day I was at a lunch and there were 7 of the 8 people at the table at this informal lunch were all women associates. And all of a sudden we started talking and I discovered that everybody else was going through the same conversations and the same thoughts about, do I wait until this case does such and such, or what do I do? And it was just really great to have people to talk with. But I will say the other thing that is useful, if you haven't yet found the right person in your life, is find someone who's supportive if you're going to have kids. Because having a supportive spouse or partner certainly is a major role for me. I never would have been doing all the Bar Association work I was doing, and probably not have made partner at Proskauer without, my husband being a significant presence and really the primary caregiver when I wasn't off on leave. So it freed me up to be able to do other things as well as having a supportive person at work who always went home to have dinner with his kids. And yes, he came back, but at least he went home and saw Louisa and her brothers. So that makes a difference. That was a role model, not that he was a great role model in every way with respect to work hours, but in terms of the priority on family, he basically right from the get-go made it clear that's an okay priority to have, and that's very helpful to have.
I just want to thank these fabulous panelists. We so appreciate your insights and your willingness to spend the evening with us. I'm sure that we've learned what women went through over 100 years ago to get us where we are, and hopefully we can continue in their shadow and to also help the next generation of women to find it easier to enter and to be successful in our chosen career.